One movie with an incredible plot twist that definitely deserves a spot on your watch list is The Invisible Guest from 2017. It follows a successful businessman who finds himself trapped inside a locked hotel room with the body of his mistress. Now, he has to prove that he had nothing to do with her murder. So, just how intense and unpredictable is this story? Let's jump right into it. The story begins inside an apartment building, where we meet Virginia Goodman, an experienced defense attorney who has been hired to meet with her client and prepare one final defense strategy just hours before his trial begins. Her client is Adrian, a successful technology entrepreneur who is currently facing a murder charge. The victim is Laura, a woman who was secretly having an affair with him. Laura was found dead inside a hotel room that had been locked from the inside, making Adrian the police's prime suspect. It's important to understand that Virginia is a highly experienced attorney who specializes in handling complicated cases like this. Since she has noticed several gaps in Adrian's version of events, she needs to dig deeper into his story and uncover every detail before the trial begins. Adrian already has a personal lawyer named Felix, who has been representing him. However, because this is such a serious murder case, Felix decides to hand the case over to someone more experienced. And Virginia is considered the perfect person to handle it. Because there are still unanswered questions surrounding the case, Virginia wants Adrian to tell her exactly what happened from the beginning, without leaving anything out. She needs him to be completely honest and give her every single detail. Because Virginia needs to understand his entire story so she can build the strongest possible defense for him in court. The story takes us to a remote hotel in the mountains, surrounded by forests and snow. Adrian and his mistress, Laura, had booked one of the hotel rooms after receiving a threatening message ordering them both to come there. But shortly after arriving, Adrian and Laura realized that the whole thing was a trap. They immediately started packing their things so they could leave. However, according to Adrian's version of events, a mysterious stranger suddenly attacked him and knocked him unconscious. The stranger then killed Laura with a blunt object. So when the authorities arrived at the hotel, Adrian was immediately treated as the prime suspect. After hearing Adrian's story, Virginia reads through the police report. According to the report, a witness heard someone screaming from inside the room, but nobody was seen leaving. The hotel room was also locked from the inside, with the security chain still attached. The window couldn't be opened from inside because the hotel had removed the handles during the winter season. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage to the room, and no other evidence suggesting that someone else had been inside. That means if Adrian goes to court and gives the exact same story he just told Virginia, the judge is unlikely to believe him and could easily find him guilty. Since Adrian's story sounds far too convenient, Virginia explains that after 30 years as a defense attorney, she has learned that there are two types of clients she usually deals with. The first type is the cooperative client, someone who is willing to work with her and tell her the truth. The second type is a client who thinks they're smarter than their own lawyer. Adrian is clearly the second type. He thinks he's clever enough to handle everything himself, yet he's still paying a lawyer because he wants to avoid going to prison. The bottom line is simple: if Adrian genuinely wants Virginia's help, he has to be completely honest with her. Otherwise, he could end up behind bars and lose everything he's worked so hard to build. Realizing that he doesn't have much time left, Adrian finally decides to tell Virginia what really happened. It all began about 3 months earlier. Adrian had lied to his wife, telling her he was going to Paris on a business trip. In reality, he was meeting Laura, the woman he had been having an affair with. It's unclear how long the affair had been going on, but Adrian still loved his wife, his young daughter, and the successful career he had worked so hard to build. But he had given in to a temptation that many men struggle to resist: another woman. While driving home, Adrian finally told Laura that he wanted to end their affair. It wasn't because he didn't care about her. Adrian simply couldn't keep living with the guilt of constantly lying to his wife and young daughter. He also didn't want to risk losing his career if the affair ever came to light and became a media scandal. Surprisingly, Laura accepted his decision and agreed that they should end things. But then, because Adrian was distracted, he suddenly lost focus while driving and accidentally crashed into another car. When they got out to check on the other driver, they discovered that the victim was a teenage boy who was already dead. Adrian was about to call the police, but Laura immediately stopped him. She was terrified that if they reported the accident, their affair would be exposed and both of their lives would be destroyed. A short while later, another driver pulled over to see if they needed help. Laura quickly pretended that Adrian and she had simply been involved in an accident with each other and assured the stranger that everything was under control. Once the driver finally left, Adrian and Laura put the young man's body into the trunk of Adrian's car. Laura then told Adrian to get rid of the car and dump the boy's body somewhere. Meanwhile, she would stay behind at the accident scene to clean up the remaining debris and wait for a tow truck to arrive and collect Adrian's damaged BMW. While Laura was waiting for the tow truck, another man named Thomas showed up. He happened to live nearby and had his own towing equipment. Thomas was a retired engineer who had previously worked for an automotive company, so he offered to take Adrian's BMW back to his house and repair it himself. But while they were on their way to Thomas's house, Laura received a phone call from her husband. That's right. Both Adrian and Laura were married and had families of their own. This makes their affair even more disturbing. They had both betrayed their marriage commitment simply to satisfy their own selfish desires. Meanwhile, Adrian spotted a nearby lake. As he looked at the water, he struggled with the decision of whether he could really go through with dumping the young man's body there. But once again, Adrian convinces himself that protecting his business, his future, and his status as a father is more important. So he finally makes up his mind and pushes the car, along with the young man's body, into the depths of the lake. Meanwhile, Laura has arrived at Thomas's house. She is immediately introduced to his wife, Elvira, who welcomes her warmly. While they wait for Thomas to finish repairing the BMW, Elvira invites Laura inside so they can chat. Inside the house, Laura notices several photographs showing that Elvira was once a fairly well-known theater actress. She had probably retired after marrying Thomas. A little later, Elvira starts talking about her only son, Daniel, who she says should be coming home soon. He's young, handsome, and clearly very important to her. Elvira even shows Laura a picture of him. Then she asks, "Do you know who that is?" Laura suddenly freezes. She realizes that the young man she and Adrian hid earlier was Daniel, the only son of Thomas and Elvira. The realization sends Laura into a panic. As soon as Thomas finishes repairing the BMW, Laura quickly thanks them and leaves. Just as planned, Laura later picks Adrian up at a secluded location, and the two of them drive away from the area. But Adrian doesn't go straight home. Instead, he takes his BMW to a scrapyard and has the entire vehicle destroyed and turned into scrap metal. He then files a false police report claiming that the car was stolen while he was in Paris. After the incident, Adrian admits that he was haunted by guilt over Daniel's death and the lies surrounding his affair with Laura. But with his wife, his daughter, and his business at stake, especially with a major project coming up, Adrian forces himself to bury his guilt and return to his normal life. Before going home, he tries to get his thoughts together so he can face his wife and pretend that everything is perfectly normal. But just when he thinks the whole nightmare is finally behind him, a news report suddenly appears about a young man named Daniel who has gone missing and is now the subject of a police investigation. Just like the saying goes, no matter how carefully you try to hide a corpse, the smell will eventually give you away. The police suddenly show up at Adrian's office and ask him to answer a few questions. Accompanied by his personal lawyer, Felix, Adrian goes to the police station as requested. There, the officers explain that Daniel's parents, Thomas and Elvira, told them they had recently encountered a mysterious woman who was driving or had access to a BMW registered under Adrian's name. The couple suspects that this woman could somehow be connected to Daniel's disappearance. So the police simply want to know whether Adrian knows this mysterious woman. Adrian confidently tells them that he has never met her and has absolutely no idea who she is. As for the BMW, Adrian had already filed a false report claiming that the car had been stolen. Because of that, the police don't have enough evidence to connect him to Daniel's disappearance. A few days later, however, another report appears in the news. Daniel is no longer being described as a missing person. Instead, the police begin to suspect that he deliberately ran away. Apparently, Daniel had a significant amount of money in his bank account, which investigators believed had been stolen from the company where he worked. Not long after the news breaks, Laura contacts Adrian and asks him to meet her. When they finally meet at a secluded location, Laura reveals the truth. The entire story about Daniel stealing money from his company was her doing. She had fabricated the story to confuse the police and make them believe Daniel had run away on his own. With her short haircut and completely different appearance, Laura explains that she had taken Daniel's phone and wallet immediately after the accident. Using the information she found in his wallet and phone, Laura was able to figure out where Daniel worked. And because her husband worked in the banking industry, Laura had access to information that allowed her to manipulate Daniel's financial records. She made it look as though the money in Daniel's bank account had actually been stolen from the company he worked for. Adrian then adds that Laura eventually started threatening him. She told him that if the truth ever came out, she would make sure Adrian was dragged into the case as well. So Adrian had no choice but to cooperate and follow the entire plan Laura had created. Despite the chaos surrounding his personal life, Adrian was incredibly successful in his professional life. His company was growing rapidly, and he was even working on a major business deal with a large Japanese company. Adrian received praise and an award for being a successful young entrepreneur. Everyone saw him as a role model and an example of success. But on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life, Adrian received an unexpected visitor. It was Thomas, the father of the young man who had disappeared. Thomas was still investigating his son's disappearance, and he was convinced that Adrian knew Laura well. His suspicions became even stronger when he noticed that Adrian owned a lighter identical to one he had previously seen inside the BMW Laura was driving. Thomas knew that Adrian was probably too afraid to tell the police the truth. If Adrian confessed, he could be arrested, sent to prison, and lose his career and reputation. So Thomas begged him to at least be honest with him. He didn't need Adrian to confess everything to the police. He simply wanted to know one thing. Where was his son Daniel's body? Because as a father himself, Adrian should understand that every parent deserves the chance to bury their child properly. Eventually, tired of Thomas constantly trying to uncover the truth, Adrian asks his personal lawyer, Felix, to deal with the situation. Felix not only tries to handle Daniel's parents, but even bribes certain police officials to put pressure on Thomas and Elvira and make them stop searching for their son. Meanwhile, the evidence continues to pile up against Daniel. Investigators become increasingly convinced that he didn't simply disappear after an accident. Instead, they believe he ran away after stealing money from the company where he worked. Eventually, the case is officially closed as an embezzlement case, with Daniel listed as the main suspect. After hearing Adrian's entire version of events, which he claims is the complete and honest truth, Virginia goes back over the timeline and connects all the pieces. There are now 2 dead victims: Daniel, whose body was dumped into the lake, and Laura, who was later found murdered inside the locked hotel room. Based on everything they've established so far, Virginia estimates that Adrian has about a 99% chance of being convicted if this story is presented in court. So they need another explanation, a much more convincing alibi. The judge might believe that Adrian dumped Daniel's body because Laura pressured him into doing it. But what about Laura's murder? She was found dead inside a hotel room that was locked from the inside, and there was seemingly no evidence that anyone other than Adrian had been there. From Virginia's perspective as an experienced specialist attorney, Adrian would almost certainly be treated as the primary suspect unless they could come up with a solid and believable explanation. That's when Adrian suddenly remembers the stranger who had stopped at the scene of the accident. And then he gets an idea. What if they made that stranger the person responsible for Laura's murder? Here's how the new story would go. Let's call the driver Samsel. According to this new version of the story, Samsel witnessed the young man's death after the collision with Adrian and Laura. He secretly watched them from a distance and followed Adrian all the way to the lake. Samsel then witnessed Adrian dumping the car and the young man's body into the lake. After that, Samsel began blackmailing Adrian. He eventually lured Adrian and Laura to a remote hotel, where he murdered Laura inside the room and framed Adrian for the crime. But before Adrian could even finish explaining this version of events, Virginia cuts him off. She immediately points out that his story is far too complicated and still doesn't explain Laura's murder. If Adrian wants to involve Samsel, what would his motive be? Money. That's it. Samsel might have wanted to blackmail Adrian, but that still doesn't give him a strong enough reason to murder Laura inside the hotel room. With his story falling apart, Adrian finally gives up and asks Virginia to come up with an alibi herself. And Virginia has another idea. She suggests involving Thomas, the father of the young man, and giving him a motive for killing Laura, revenge. Here's how Virginia's version of the story would work. As we already know, Thomas and Elvira have been desperately searching for justice for their son, Daniel, after becoming frustrated with the police investigation. Eventually, Thomas decides to take matters into his own hands. He wants revenge against the 2 people he believes are responsible for his son's disappearance, Adrian and Laura. The plan begins when Thomas contacts Adrian and Laura and convinces them to meet at a remote hotel. He books the room in advance and secretly hides inside the closet. When Adrian and Laura enter the room, Thomas suddenly attacks Laura with a blunt object, killing her instantly. He then knocks Adrian unconscious and leaves him behind, making it look as though Adrian was responsible for the murder. And as for Adrian's earlier question, Virginia already has an answer. She shows him several photographs taken at the crime scene. In the photos, Elvira, Thomas's wife, can be seen at the hotel. According to the information Virginia has uncovered, Elvira actually works at that remote hotel. That means Thomas's escape from the room without leaving any evidence could have been carefully planned with Elvira's help. Thomas would simply hide inside the closet and wait for Adrian and Laura to arrive. Once they entered the room, he would kill Laura, knock Adrian unconscious, then escape through the window. Meanwhile, Elvira would have already opened the window of the neighboring room from the outside. Thomas could then climb through that window and disappear without leaving any trace. Virginia's version of events sounds much more believable. A judge could easily believe that Thomas was responsible for Laura's murder, while Adrian would appear to be nothing more than an innocent man who had been caught up in the entire situation. But Virginia still wants to make Adrian completely separate from the accident that killed Daniel. So she suggests that Adrian claim he was in Paris when the accident happened. That would automatically make Laura look like the sole person responsible for the crash that killed Daniel. But there's one problem. They need evidence proving that Laura was alone with Daniel during the accident. So Virginia suggests planting one of Laura's personal belongings inside the young man's car, something like a bracelet, to make it appear that she was the only person involved. For that to work, Virginia needs Adrian to show her exactly where he dumped the car and the young man's body. Adrian finally gives her the exact location where the car was submerged. But then he admits something he had been hiding all this time. The young man wasn't actually dead when Adrian dumped him into the lake. He was still alive. But by that point, Adrian had already gone too far. He didn't want to lose his career, his reputation, or the life he had built, so he chose to continue with the plan. Technically, that makes Adrian a killer and the true person responsible for the young man's death. Finally, Adrian decides to tell Virginia everything. He admits that Laura never forced him to dump the young man into the lake. It was entirely his own decision. In fact, Laura was the one who was terrified and wanted to call the police. Adrian was the one who stopped her. He also admits that he was the one who took the young man's wallet and phone. And the story about the stolen company money? That was his idea too. Laura had nothing to do with it. Adrian had asked his personal lawyer, Felix, to find a hacker who could manipulate the young man's financial records and make it look as though he had stolen money from the company where he worked. While Adrian was enjoying his successful career, Laura was the one who couldn't escape the guilt. The more time passed, the more she regretted what they had done. Eventually, Laura decided she needed to make things right. She secretly contacted Thomas and Elvira and told them the truth. She confessed that she and Adrian were responsible for their son's death. Knowing that Adrian would never agree to confess, Laura asked him to meet her at the remote hotel without telling him what she had planned. When Adrian arrived at the hotel room, Laura finally revealed the truth. She told him that she had already contacted Daniel's parents and that they would be arriving soon. The moment Adrian realized that Laura was about to expose everything, he knew his career and entire life were about to collapse. Consumed by panic and rage, Adrian grabbed a blunt object and killed Laura himself. And that is the shocking twist. Even Virginia, an experienced specialist attorney, never saw it coming. The man we had been sympathizing with from the very beginning turns out to be a cold-blooded killer and the true mastermind behind the deaths of both victims, Daniel and Laura. Adrian is nothing more than a selfish man who cares about protecting his career and his own life, no matter who has to suffer because of his choices. Now that Adrian has finally told Virginia the complete truth, she can actually help him. She can build the strongest possible alibi and prepare his defense for the upcoming trial. For the first time, Adrian looks relieved. He has finally stopped hiding anything, but as soon as Virginia leaves to prepare the alibi and organize the necessary documents for the trial, Adrian immediately calls his personal lawyer, Felix. He wants to know whether Virginia can really be trusted. Felix assures him that Virginia is a highly experienced specialist attorney who has spent decades handling cases like this. That alone should be enough to prove that she is exactly the right person to handle Adrian's case. And then Adrian's phone suddenly starts experiencing static interference. A moment later, the pen in his shirt pocket begins leaking ink. Confused, Adrian takes it out and opens it. And that's when the truth is finally revealed. Hidden inside the pen is a tiny long-range microphone. Without Adrian realizing it, Virginia had given him the pen during their interview earlier. And this is where the movie delivers one of its biggest twists. Throughout their entire conversation, Thomas had actually been hiding in the building next door, listening to and recording everything Adrian said through the microphone hidden inside the pen. His goal was to get a direct confession from Adrian, a confession proving that Adrian was the person responsible for the deaths of both the young man and Laura. He also needed Adrian to reveal the exact location where the young man's car and body had been dumped. But there's an even bigger revelation. The Virginia we've been watching throughout the entire movie isn't Virginia at all. She's actually Elvira, Thomas's wife, disguised as the specialist attorney. Remember when Laura visited Thomas and Elvira's house earlier and saw those old photographs? Those photos revealed that Elvira had once been a professional theater actress who was quite well known, so it wasn't difficult for her to convincingly play the role of Virginia, an experienced specialist attorney. But then the question remains, where is the real Virginia? And just like that, the movie delivers an incredibly satisfying ending. With Adrian's recorded confession and the exact location where the young man's body was dumped, Thomas and Elvira finally have enough evidence to bring Adrian to justice. And that's what makes The Invisible Guest such an incredible mystery thriller.